Hello everyone and welcome to this series based around students' exceptional work. This year, the Norwich Economic Publication has the wish to promote as much as possible exceptional work from students who did an outstanding job for their assessment. In this presentation, the group delves into the concept of carbon taxation, exploring its role in mitigating climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They examine the benefits and challenges of implementing a carbon tax, its economic and environmental impact, and alternative policy measures such as cap-and-trade systems and renewable initiatives. Through real-world examples from countries like Sweden, Canada, and Australia, the group provides a comprehensive analysis of how carbon pricing strategies shape global efforts to combat climate change. Now we're pleased to hand over the spotlight to this work, which is a truly good example of global collaborative conversation, where students from 4 different countries have come together through a collaborative online international learning project to address global pressing issues. Thank you for tuning in.
I'm Olivia Geyer, and I go to the University of Illinois.
Hi, my name is Kayetan Nard. I go to the University of Illinois as well.
Hi, I'm Amy Adriana. I go to UEA, University of East Anglia.
Hi, I'm Yunsan Kwon. I go to UAUC.
Hi, my name is Aya and I go to Maastricht University.
And we did an analysis on carbon taxes for our presentation.
First thing first, we need to know what are carbon emissions. So basically, we're talking about this CO2, which is carbon dioxide. And it is a big problem, but it's caused by a small molecule. Yes, carbon dioxide might be tiny, but it's making an outsized impact on our world. It's like the ultimate overachiever. So, carbon emissions are like nature's invisible exhale, except these emissions are primarily human-made. Every time we burn fossil fuels, whether for energy, transportation, or industry, we're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And while carbon dioxide doesn't wear a villain's cape, it's the ultimate undercover operative in global warming. It traps heat in the atmosphere like a greenhouse we can't escape. Okay, the next one is we're going to talk about the cross-border concerns. Carbon dioxide doesn't stop just right at where it comes from. It goes everywhere. It travels across the border. It needs no visa. It just goes everywhere. So carbon dioxide, such as methane, nitrous oxide, are not just confined where it is. They disperse throughout the atmosphere. It contributes to global warming. So this causes global climate shifts, including rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and ecosystem disruptions in countries far from the source of emission. It's like my neighbor is having global warming because of me burning my trash. Next thing is health and environmental issues. So the air pollution will be caused by this carbon-intensive industries. It crosses national borders, impacting air quality and public health in neighboring countries. This includes smoke, acid rain, and particulate matter that spread from one region to another, often exacerbated by agricultural practices like deforestation and crop burning. Another health and environmental issues is ocean acidification. Excess carbon dioxide will be absorbed by the oceans, lead to acidification, which harms marine ecosystems, including coral reefs and fisheries. This has significant effects on coastal communities, particularly those that depend on marine resources for food and income.
There are more environmental concerns such as floods and droughts. According to the article, warming makes droughts, extreme wet events more frequent in intense, published by NASA. More than 20% of the economic losses of extreme weather events in the US is caused by floods and droughts every year. And these floods and droughts will increase as global temperature rises, because warmer air can contain more water, which lead to drier lands and heavier rain and snow afterwards. Extreme heat is another consequence of temperature rise. According to the article by World Resource Institute, which is written based on 2023 IPCC report, heat wave will happen more frequently by 4.1 times with 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming and 5.6 times with 2 degrees of Celsius. And the intensity is also projected to be stronger by 1.9 degrees Celsius and 2.6 degrees Celsius. Due to increase in global temperatures, animals that live in warm area move their habitats to higher altitudes. As new animal species appear in new environment, native animals that have been living in the area can be disrupted and can be exposed to extinction. Not only animals, plants also, which can be moved their habitat, are also exposed in danger of extinction. Moreover, due to more frequent extreme weathers and rise of sea level, it will be harder for animals and plants to live. There are many others environmental concerns such as decrease in agricultural productivity and more frequency of wildfires. Carbon tax is one of the policies to prevent further negative effects of greenhouse gas. Carbon tax is defined as a form of explicit carbon pricing directly linked to the level of carbon dioxide emissions, often expressed as a value of ton CO2 equivalent, which is denoted as TCO2e. CO2e is carbon dioxide equivalent. Different greenhouse gases in a common unit, which is CO2, according to the definition by Ecometrica. There are many components that consist greenhouse gas other than carbon dioxide, such as methane, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases. And CO2e let this greenhouse gas effect converted into the amount of CO2. Therefore, carbon tax applies to not only carbon dioxide but also other greenhouse gases. The following are benefits and disadvantages of carbon tax policy.
So the main obvious benefit of carbon taxes is the reduce of carbon emissions. So carbon producers use price as a very important signal to determine how much they will demand and supply. Currently, energy prices are not correctly representative to their social costs, and this creates a negative externality where when the quantity produced is higher than what should be or according to the efficient amount. As you can see in the top right graph, a tax would bring the market to reflect the marginal spillover costs, and both sides will have the costs internalized. Therefore, with an increased cost, there should be a new market equilibrium that will which the quantity will be less than it was before, and therefore producers will emit less carbon. Same thing as consumers as well, and this will also increase tax revenue. If used properly, this carbon taxes can create a revenue recycling effect. So carbon taxes can hurt consumers since it will increase prices and there will be increased costs. But if the revenue of these taxes can be used to offset other costs, so for example, it can lower other taxes like labor and capital, and therefore these costs of the carbon taxes will be mitigated. Another benefit is efficiency. So for businesses, a per unit tax can be a simple and clear price signal that they can easily put in their business plans. And for government, it can be an easy to enforce method that can decrease administrative costs, unlike complex regulation laws. And the final one is that it can boost innovation. So it can incentivize companies to develop more efficient solutions to decrease their taxation or their carbon emissions. And it can also make corporations more involved and invested to prevent carbon emissions and participate more in the fight against climate change. So one example is Sweden. In 1991, they implemented a carbon tax, and they did this alongside a income and corporate tax decrease to offset the costs and to stimulate the growth. And since then, they've reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by around 27%, and its economy has grown by 78%. So we can see that it's been very effective. Finland was actually the first country to implement these tax. They did it for both peat and natural gas. They did do exemptions for some critical areas of industry, like their wood exportation, and this has resulted in a 50 to 40% decrease in their carbon emissions from 1990 to 2018. And Canada, their taxes are implemented and they vary on their provincial level. So taxes and its rates are broken up based on small businesses, households, and the industrial usage. And then all the tax revenue is invested back into the provincial governments, or their citizens are given a direct tax credit. And actually, certain provinces receive a high efficiency in ranking scores in a metric study that analyzed these carbon taxes. And these different versions of carbon taxes have been employed through varying nations, but it appears that more broad and uniform taxes are more effective, as well as ones that provide direct relief to the customer increases the effectiveness of these taxes.
And despite all the benefits of carbon taxes, there are also several negative sides that come with carbon taxes. One example is there's economic burden on low-income households. These taxes can affect low-income households because low-income households tend to spend a higher percentage of their income on energy, heating, and transportation, which would become more expensive with a carbon tax, therefore affecting the low-income households. Second, it also can impact businesses. Carbon taxes increase the cost of fossil fuels, which could lead to higher production costs, especially for industries relying on energy processes, such as manufacturing, transportation, and agriculture industries. Another example is carbon leakage. Carbon taxes might cause carbon leakage, which is when businesses relocate production to countries with less stringent environmental regulations. And this doesn't necessarily lead to a reduction in emissions, but instead it just relocates where the emissions are. So the carbon taxes aren't actually help with the environment. Another negative side is political and public opposition. Carbon taxes can face some political resistance, usually from groups such as like fossil fuel industries or transportation groups, also agriculture industries. And in some cases, public backlash can derail the implementation of carbon taxes. And then also, there is an uncertain impact on emissions. The effectiveness of a carbon tax in reducing emissions depends on the tax rate, how it's implemented, and whether there are policies such as subsidies. And without a sufficiently high tax or additional policies, the emission reduction may be less than expected. There's also a negative impact on industries. Carbon taxes can harm vulnerable industries such as coal and oil industries, leading to job losses. And then finally, administration and compliance costs. Setting up a carbon tax system, including monitoring and enforcement, can be complex and costly, so it's not always feasible to implement. And then here are a few examples. In the United States, low-income households typically spend about 7% of their income on energy costs compared to around 3% for higher income households. So this shows how a carbon tax could greatly affect the low-income families. Another example is there could be a situation where the EU or Canada implements high carbon taxes, but countries like China or India do not. And energy-intensive industries in these areas might relocate to those countries to avoid the tax, which will also result in no reduction in global emissions. Another example is in France, a proposed carbon tax in 2018 led to many protests. Many French citizens felt the tax unfairly targeted people without providing any alternatives, for example, public transportation, and the tax was eventually removed. And then my last example is a carbon tax in Australia ended up leading to higher costs for industries like coal, already been facing challenges from global competition, and workers in these industries could lose jobs, which may not be easily replaced in regions heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And then we also included some statistics. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as the OECD, which is an international organization that promotes economic growth, prosperity, and sustainable development, they did a study on carbon taxes and competitiveness, suggested that depending on the sector, carbon taxes could lead to losses in GDP growth of around 0.1 to 0.2% per year, particularly in industries that are energy intensive. Another study was done in 2019 by the World Bank, and they found that carbon leakage could be a significant problem, estimating that in some sectors, carbon leakage could be 30% or more of the emission reductions expected from carbon pricing, particularly for industries like steel and aluminum. And according to a 2021 poll by the Pew Research Center, 60% of Americans were skeptical of implementing a carbon tax, largely due to concerns over increased energy prices and economic hardship. And then our last stat that we included was in Australia, the carbon tax that was introduced in 2012 was estimated to have cost the country around $9 billion per year in lost economic output and increased production costs, particularly in heavy industries. This tax was later removed in 2014 after significant pushback from the public and industries.
Okay, so carbon tax has alternatives. First one is a cap and trade system. A cap and trade system sets a limit, that means cap, on total greenhouse gas emissions and allows companies with low emissions to sell their extra allowance to larger emitters. So we can see an example that this system has provided already covered around 45% of the EU total greenhouse gas emissions. And their goal is to reduce the emissions by 40% below the 1990 levels. And by 2030, by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Another system is carbon border adjustment mechanism. That means that countries can impose fees on imported goods based on their carbon content, and thereby they can also make foreign producers to adopt cleaner practices. And we can see that implementing the CBAM system could reduce carbon leakage that we talked about by 5% to 30% in industrialized countries. Another system is a direct regulation and standard. That means that governments can implement strict regulations that mandate specific emission standards for industry or vehicles. An example for that is the Clean Air Act in the US. And we can see that the Clean Act had led to a reduction of 70% in 6 common air pollutants since its enactment in 1970, demonstrating the effectiveness of regulatory measures in improving the air quality. And of course, another example is a renewable energy initiative. And by financial initiative for renewable energy sources, we can reduce the reliance on fossil fuels, and then by that we're lowering overall carbon emissions. And if we subsidize and tax it, and we can give a different credit for solar, wind, and other renewable energy projects, we can lower the emissions. And we can see an example that according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, it's already shipped to a reduction of up to 70% in CO2 emissions from the power sector. And if the current trends will continue, it can be this reduction by 2050. Another one is also a different perspective in investment in carbon capture and storage. This technology captures carbon dioxide emissions from sources like power plants and stores it underground and repurposes it. And projects like the Norway Longship project are designed to capture and store CO2 for industrial process. And we can see that there are by 2022, there are over 30 operational large-scale CCS facilities worldwide. So they're capturing approximately 40 million tons of CO2 annually. And the last one is behavioral initiative in education. And by aiming at changing consumer behavior through education initiative, we can reduce carbon footprint. And we can see that by that, cities that invest in public transit, like educational change, saw an average reduction of 10 to 20% in vehicle mile travels, which correlates with lower emissions.
So obviously, with climate change, carbon emissions is a huge, important matter, especially when looking at cross-border concerns. One of these ways to address this is, of course, carbon taxes. However, there are both benefits and negative aspects that of these carbon taxes that nations need to consider whether they're worth it or not, and as well as the implementation. But if a nation thinks that it's not a best fit for carbon taxes, there are a lot of other choices that they can do, like cap and trade, like CBAM as well. But overall, there is some hope that these will be addressed in the future. And thank you very much.